Well, hello, hello. Oh, we gotta scroll up. There it is. All right, cool. Hi, Noe. Hi, Meep. Hi, Leo. Very eepy. A little bit of milk. Well, hope you have a good lunch. A random guy. Also very eepy. Hi, Toei. Hi, Beryl. You are sad? Oh my gosh. Jess. Did I hit 600 like 2 months ago? Yes. Did I only do this because someone gave me a deadline? And I'm a horrible procrastinator and nothing will ever get done if there's not a deadline? Yes. So here we are. We did it. I have put together, it's like 50 slides. And I'll probably get off topic and go on tangents and all that fun stuff. As one tends to do on occasion. But yes. I can't promise the PowerPoint's good. I was literally adding stuff to it 10 minutes ago, and I made it last night because, again, I'm a horrible procrastinator, and that's just how my brain lets me do stuff. Which is just another way to say it doesn't let me do stuff, but it's fine. But yes, I wonder who did that. Whoa, I don't know. I don't know. That's crazy. That's crazy. Anyway, but yes. So today I will be teaching you history stuff, particularly history stuff about boats, because that's what I know entirely too much of. Like, well, ooh, yes, have a good lurk, and I know the drawing is going to be beautiful. There's stuff in my throat, which is not ideal. But yes, in particular, we're going to be looking at capital ship development in the interwar period, which, for those of you that don't know what that means, a capital ship can technically refer to anything from a heavy cruiser to an aircraft carrier. We're in particular looking at battle cruisers and battleships. Interwar period being, I mean, we have some World War One background, and then we're going through and we're going to go through all the different ships and stuff and their development and all that sort of fun stuff. So, yeah. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in chat. I will do my best to answer them. But yeah, off we go. Where did I even start on this? I don't remember. Oh yeah, so just wanted to give you all a basic outline of what different classes and different things are. Just set you a little bit more familiar so that things I say later maybe make a little bit more sense. Here's the three gun-armed type of like gun is like the primary weapon sort of capital ships that you'll see. Battleships, of course, are pretty obvious. They're expensive, lots of armor, massive guns. And this is going by more of the World War I definitions. Battleships were normally on the slowest, and even in World War II, battleships were usually not as fast as the cruisers and destroyers and aircraft carriers that they worked alongside. Battle cruisers usually still had decent armor. It was nothing amazing, but they'd still have the same heavy guns that battleships had, and as a result of having less armor, they were lighter and could be faster. It is important to note, cost-wise, they were roughly similar, and size-wise, they were roughly similar. It's just, you know, you sacrifice the armor from the battleship for the speed of the battlecruiser, is more or less how that worked out. Again, there are variations. It's not all exact cut and dry. There's a lot of gray in there, but that's the basics of it. And then your cruisers are obviously a lot less armor, smaller guns, like, you know, whereas a battleship may have anywhere from 11 to 18-inch guns, the cruisers are normally looking at about 8 inches. And that number there is telling you the diameter of the shell, not like the circumference or anything. That is from one side to the other, how far it is. But cruisers, as a result, were also fast because smaller guns, less armor. Yes, those powerful engines, but they're also a lot smaller ships, so there's not as much to move. And as a result, also much cheaper, which means that you could build a lot more of them. Granted, would you rather have one battleship or like 4 cruisers? You'd probably rather have the battleship. It would probably win that fight. But these are good for power projection, you know, showing the flag and just having more ships. Which is not, I mean, as I think it was I think it's quoted as a Stalin quote. Well, I believe it may be misquoted and it was actually someone else. But quantity has a quality all of its own. Basically, throw enough shit at the wall and some of it's going to stick. So, giving a World War I era background, just so you can sort of see where battleships were at, or where capital ships in particular were at prior to the interwar period, like what was going on. There wasn't a massive amount, given how many battleships, like how large the capital ship navies were of the various different countries involved, there wasn't a massive amount of major battles. The biggest one being the Battle of Jutland, which is the only battle where the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, which was the bulk of their battleship forces, met with the German High Seas Fleet, which was the bulk of their battleship forces. And given how many ships were involved, there were obviously losses, but the losses weren't massive. And that was kind of the only one. After that, they never really fought each other. It was just like small skirmishes here and there, because they were both terrified of losing their navies, essentially. And like, the Germans were the ones that really had to go out, because they were the ones being blockaded. The British could kind of just sit there and wait for the Germans to come to them, and the Germans didn't want to lose their ships, so they didn't. But you had your battleships, which of course, the mainstay of the fleets at this point in time. They were the most powerful ships in their respective fleets. In particular, you had the dreadnoughts versus the pre-dreadnought battleships, which I've realized that my model here, I'm gonna be small in the corner so that you guys can see more of this, because I didn't do this quite properly for it, but it's fine. So in, I believe it was 1906, the Royal Navy introduced HMS Dreadnought, which was the first of a new type of battleship that essentially made everything before it obsolete. That's why in this time period you have dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts. Pre-dreadnoughts, obviously the older designs that were still useful, but if put up against a dreadnought, would not do well. They were slower, less main guns, armor was usually worse, stuff like that. North Sea had the major fleets, which was the Germans and the British. Mediterranean had the French and the Italians, who ended up being on the same side, and the Austro-Hungarians, whose battleships never actually really went and did anything, because, like everyone else, they were scared of losing them. And as I mentioned before, that Battle of Jutland is really the only major battle that came from that war, or the only major naval action. There were lots of smaller actions, but that was really the big one. If you look at battle cruisers, the battle cruiser was a concept introduced in the British. I don't remember exactly off my top of the head what the admiral's name was. I believe it started with an F. But the general idea was outgun anything you can't outrun and outrun anything you can't outgun. So essentially, yeah, it wouldn't be able to go toe-to-toe with the battleship because the battleship has more armor than the battle cruiser, but the battle cruiser can run away because it's a lot faster. Versus against a cruiser, yeah, the cruiser might be faster, but it's gonna lose horribly against a battle cruiser, ideally. There were some mixed successes. I know the Germans in particular used them to sort of go out and harass the British blockade in various different merchant ships and, try to snipe off smaller parts of the Royal Navy where they could. But as particularly the British saw at the Battle of Jutland, if not managed properly, they could explode massively. Now, that's not necessarily a complete fault of the design of the ships. Part of that is down to the British sailors and their commanders' handling of them. For instance, leaving important things like flash doors open, which means that if a fire starts somewhere in the ship, it can get to the magazine, which is really not where you want it to be because that's where all the explosives are. And so the British did see much higher attrition in battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland than the Germans did. That's also in part due to the designs. The Germans, knowing that they would likely be outnumbered by the British, tended to put a little bit more armor on their battle cruisers, but have slightly smaller guns. So while a British battle cruiser might have, say, 13 or 15-inch guns, the equivalent German one would have 11 or 12-inch but they would have a little bit more armor than the British, and therefore could theoretically take some more hits. Not to say the Germans got off scot-free. They still took some losses. But so battle cruisers already, this is relatively soon after their introduction, we're already seeing some fairly limited success. It was only a little bit, though. They weren't the massive success that they were hoped to be on either side. But it is what it is. So, after World War I, this is where we really get into the interwar period, obviously, after the war. And what you initially see is it's looking like there's going to be a pretty major naval arms race. Hi, Seth. It's looking like there's going to be a pretty substantial naval arms race. You know, the Americans are getting involved in building larger, more powerful ships. The British are doing it, trying to keep up. The Japanese are getting involved in it. France and Italy are trying to get involved in it as well. Germany, of course, at this point, after losing World War I, is not allowed to get involved in it because they're not really allowed to have much of a navy. They're allowed to have a little bit, but not a lot. And the problem that comes out of this is they just finished a major war. None of these countries, with the exception of maybe the US, can particularly afford a naval arms race like this. Because battleship development and battlecruiser development is very expensive, and then building them is also extremely expensive, and then maintaining them is also very expensive. So you've got all these massive navies after the war that are, I'm sorry to learn, well, that's what I'm here for. So you have all these massive navies after the war that are continuing to ramp up design and production of major ships that they can't really afford to keep doing. And so what they come down to is they all sit down at the Washington Naval Treaty, and they work out a general basis on how to stop this. So in 1922, the US, UK, Japan, France, and Italy all sit down, looking at their various different like colonial or geopolitical situations. They work out, okay, what countries will be allowed to maintain what level of ship, essentially. But on the first part, they put a 10-year pause on any building of capital ships. No battle cruisers or battleships can be built. You can modernize what you've already got, but you can't build anything new. And they work out a general ratio of 5, 5, 3, and then like 1 2/3. So essentially for every 5 capital ships that the US and the UK has, Japan can have 3, and France and Italy can have 1 2/3. And they set a max tonnage for the overall fleet and a max ship number for the overall fleet, meaning that, of course, they also then have to go back and scrap a lot of the ships they have because, for instance, like the UK is way over what they're allowed. I mean, so is the US. Of course, at this point, they're already scrapping all their pre-dreadnoughts because they're proven to be kind of useless. And so they go through and they scrap or repurpose a lot of their ships and update the ones they got left for the most part. Hi, Yuma. It also puts out some basic cruiser requirements. There's a lot more that goes into this as well whenever you get to like these smaller ships. Oh my gosh, he's licking the nip. And giving a headbutt, thank you. And a stretch. Oh my gosh. And a hydrate. Okay. But in particular, we're looking at the capital ships. So, 10-year pause, so until 1932, no one could build more capital ships. They all agree on it, they all sign it. There's some, of course, back and forth. Not everyone's happy with it. Like the French think that they should have more, but there was some stuff in like the submarine clause that they got in for the French. So the French were like, okay, well, we'll sacrifice on the capital ships to get this other stuff in, and you know, politics, essentially. But they get that through, they get it signed, and they continue on. The naval arms race is brought to a halt, luckily, because obviously, again, it's expensive. They couldn't really afford it. Then in 1930, you have the London Naval Treaty. What this sees is this essentially goes in and sets a further reduction in capital ships for the US, the UK, and Japan in particular, saying, hey, okay, now you've got to have less. So they have to go through, scrap more, or repurpose more of their ships. It also defines the difference between a heavy and a light cruiser. Generally being the gun size, light cruisers are allowed up to 6-inch guns, heavy cruisers up to 8-inch guns. Basically just has it all officially recorded, more or less. And then it says cruiser tonnage limits for the various different types. You can have this many tons of heavy cruiser in your fleet, this many tons of light cruiser. The cruisers can only be up to 10,000 tons in total per ship. So limiting the size and all that as well. And then that date's not right. I must have mistyped. I believe this is supposed to be 1936, not 1939. I'm just dumb. So ignore that, 1936. So the US, the UK, and of course their colonies, and then France. Initially, Italy and Japan are involved. History stream, let's fucking go. Hi, Zectra. But Italy and Japan are sort of in it, and then they kind of back out because they realize we don't really want to be involved in this. Thank you for the tier 1 sub, Zectra. Oh, that was a hiccup. You are very sweet. And the goal of this is to more or less extend the Washington Naval Treaty. Like, hey, these limits that we've got, we're gonna, continue using these as the limits so that no one builds anything ridiculous. It sets capital ship limitations, which were already vague, which were already pretty much established in the Washington Naval Treaty, but like, for instance, a maximum tonnage of 35,000 tons, 14-inch guns as the max that you could use. But after Japan and Italy backed out, obviously the UK, the US, and France were like, well, if they're going to go and build whatever they want because they're not involved in the treaty because they refused to sign it, we obviously need to be able to counteract that in some way, shape, or form. So they include the escalator clause, basically saying if Italy or Japan don't sign by April of 1937, that maximum gun size will go from 14-inch up to 16-inch, and that maximum tonnage will go from 35,000 tons up to 45,000 tons, basically allowing them to build larger, stronger ships to hopefully compete with whatever Japan and Italy are building since they refused to sign. 14-inch to 6. Oh, that's crazy. Now, in 1935, Germany and Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Essentially, what this does is this removes the limits that the Treaty of Versailles placed on Germany, which is basically, yeah, you can't really build anything, sorry. And Germany is allowed to build a navy, but it can only be up to 35% of the tonnage of the Royal Navy. Now, importantly here, this is purely between Germany and the UK. France and Italy, or any other European or any other powers in period, were not included. This can become kind of a problem because that 35% of the tonnage of the Royal Navy essentially means that Germany can build a navy up to what the French are allowed to build and up to what the Italians are allowed to build. Which, if you're France and you're sitting there looking at it like, okay, UK, what the fuck? But it also doesn't, it effectively shoehorns Germany into the Washington Naval Treaty, but also not quite, so they could theoretically get away with building more powerful ships than the French or Italians would be allowed to under that treaty. Keep in mind, 1935, this is prior to the, again, 1936, not 1939. I'm going to fix that just because that bugs me. This is prior to the Second London Naval Treaty. Keep in mind, Germany was not involved in this one either. Now, they were still expected to follow the rules more or less, but they were not an official signatory, which is kind of important if you're trying to actually force that. So, this is what allowed Germany to start building a navy. Again, not great if you're France. In particular, Italy is on the other side, is on the southern part of Europe. Germany's on the northern side, so they're not as concerned about the German navy. But the French are kind of concerned about it because obviously they're have a lot of Northern Europe as well. A lot of Northern European coastline. And so the Navy up there, kind of important. So as a result of this, we're going to go through and basically talk through the different ship classes and their development. And I was going to split it by countries, but because of this sort of arms race going on, Italy, Germany, and France it's sort of like one country built this ship, so this country built this ship in response, so this country built this ship in response. And it sort of goes through that whole motion. And so I was like, it makes more sense for those ones at least to sort of go through them chronologically, or like what was in response to what. So starting in 1933, Germany, this is prior to the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, so Germany still has more limitations. They're still under the limits of the Treaty of Versailles that they're totally following. Absolutely don't know what you're talking about. We would never cheat on those. They build the Deutschland class. Now, some people, a lot of people like to call these pocket battleships. Some people try to call them battle cruisers, which they sort of apply if you look at the definition of a battle cruiser. But in the interwar period, especially getting into World War II, the battle cruiser sort of becomes lost and the title becomes a lot more murky because battleships, like actual battleships, get a lot quicker. And so it's kind of like, okay, where does the battle cruiser fit in here? And the answer is it really doesn't. But the Germans called them Panzerschiff, which is just an armored ship, because that's essentially what they were. Now, what these had is these did have 6 11-inch guns and 2 triple turrets. If you look at the pictures, you can see that forward turret there, rear turret there. Which that wasn't an issue. No one was really concerned with the Germans having that. They built 3 of them in total. Now, technically, under their treaty obligations at the time, these were supposed to be a maximum of 10,000 tons. And the Germans claimed that they were. They were, in fact, 11,700 roughly at standard and at full load. So standard is basically like when the ship is empty. That's the tonnage of water that the ship's displaced. Full load is whenever the ship is fully loaded down with men, supplies, ammunition, fuel, water, all that. That's how much it actually displaces. So 11,700 normal or standard, and a lot more than that, of course, a couple thousand more tons normally at full load. So a little bit over the treaty limits. 28 knots meant that, of course, they were faster than World War I era battleships, but importantly, they weren't. Granted, no one knew this at the time because no one had built any battleships really in the interwar period because of the whole Washington Naval Treaty. Here we're putting a 10-year pause on this and then extending that with the subsequent treaties. But 28 knots at the time made it faster than pretty much any of the battleships that any nations really had. Existing battle cruisers could outrun them, but there were only really 3 of those left at this point. And they were just meant as, Germany's got something. And throughout the course of the war, all 3 ships would be sunk. None of them survived. The majority of the German surface fleet didn't survive, so that's not a massive shock there. But none of those guys made it. And yeah, again, totally treaty cruisers. Don't know what you guys are talking about. They absolutely followed all the rules, even though they 100% didn't. But then I could tell you. And of course, I can't exactly show that flag, so I'm gonna have a flag of the ships and whatever ship we're looking at. I'm gonna have the flag of the country in the bottom left, just so you guys know what country we're talking about, if you can recognize the flag at least. But I can't show that one. So in response to this, the Dunkirks were built by the French. The French, obviously, during the building freeze, countries were still, researching and coming up with theoretical designs and stuff. And the French wanted a sort of smaller, modern battleship design. It was one of the ones that they looked into. And whenever they found out about the Deutschlands, they were like, okay, that could be a bit of a problem, because obviously, again, those things are faster than any of our World War I era battleships, so we don't have anything that can catch up to them, so they can kind of run around, and they'll still beat the snot out of our cruisers because they have 11-inch guns. So we need something that can counter that. And so the French, at this point, the building freeze was over. We're past that 10-year period. And so the French are like, we know it's been extended, but we're going to start building these because we need something to counter the Deutschlands. And France, Jesus, I can't talk. France didn't have a massive amount of battleships to begin with. So they developed the Dunkirks. They go through a bunch of different designs. This is the one they land on. It's an all-forward gun layout, 8 guns and 2 quadruple turrets, which at this time, the French were the only ones who had really developed quadruple turrets for battleships. They had some World War I era designs that involved these that they were looking at and probably going to start building, but then they were canceled because of the subsequent naval treaties that limited stuff. Like, well, we can't build those now. But they continued that. One interesting thing with these turrets is they are actually designed with a armored bulkhead down the middle, because normally a turret getting knocked out is a problem. If an enemy shell happens to get into the turret and blow up, that turret's now out of action. When you've only got 2 turrets with all your guns, that can be a problem. So they put that bulkhead down the middle, so that way, theoretically, if a shell made it into the turret, it would only take out 1/2 of the turret, so only 2 guns instead of all 4. But these came into service in 1937. They're 26,000 tons. Keep in mind that under the treaty limits, the tonnage limit for an individual ship was set at 35,000, so well under that. They could do 29.5 knots, so making them the fastest, technically, battle cruiser or battleship in the world at the time. Still not quite as fast as the battle cruisers, but the battle cruisers that still existed, mind you, but faster than all the World War I era battleships. And importantly, gave them a little bit of a speed advantage over the Deutschlands. They were armored, in particular, against the Deutschland's 11-inch guns. So, not massively heavy armor, not supposed to go up against like 15 or 16-inch guns, but meant to handle those 11-inch guns. And they were armed themselves with 13-inch guns that would make mincemeat of the Deutschlands, because the Deutschlands were only really armored against cruiser caliber fire, not against anything larger than that, so 8-inch guns at the most. Importantly, we'll touch more on this bullet point here, with the second one being up armored. There were 2 ships, the Dunkirk and the Strasbourg. Strasbourg was slightly modified design based on Italian developments, or in response to Italian developments. They were both sunk, but they were self-inflicted. So after France had fallen, of course, they were under the control of Germany. The southern portion of France was under control of the Vichy French government, which was essentially a German puppet. And that's where the majority of the French Navy was, at least the French Navy in Europe, was being kept there. There were some French ships in North Africa that the British in particular were concerned about going over to join the Vichy French or even German side. And so the British did send a fleet down there in what became known as the attack on Mers el Kabir, basically demanding that those French ships either join the British or get sunk. The French ships said no because, of course, it was a very complex political situation at that point in time, and no one wanted to fuck shit up. Actually, I realized I can make myself bigger again because we're past the part where there should be words on that side of the screen for a while. And the Strasbourg was there, and so she was involved in that attack. She was the only ship that was able to get out of that attack, essentially. Yes, boats. So she went up to Toulon in southern France, which is where the majority of the rest of the fleet was kept, including the Dunkirk. And then, I forget what the Ash, how are you? Forget what the name of the German operation was, but essentially when Germany annexed Vichy France, French and France keeps messing me up. They attempted to take the French fleet that was docked in Toulon, which was, again, a very sizable fleet, included the Strasbourg and the Dunkirk, as well as a bunch of cruisers and destroyers. The French, of course, having been relatively certain or not surprised if something like this happened, were ready, more or less. So they delayed the Germans a little bit as they were trying to get into the shipyard and successfully managed to scuttle pretty much all of the ships, which, for those of you that don't know, scuttling is essentially when you place charges at the bottom of your ship to sink it yourself. So they managed to, and I believe one of the ships, I believe it was the Dunkirk, was actually in dry dock, but they essentially destroyed the dry docks that the ship was then effectively sunk as well. So they were both sunk, but they were sunk by the French so that the Germans couldn't get them. Unfortunately, these are honestly some of my favorite ships. They unfortunately didn't really ever see any use. Hi, Gerald. It would have been interesting to see what they could actually do. I do know that they did have some design issues. Again, it was the first battleship anyone had built in at least 10 years. First battleship the French had built for sure in at least 10 years. And so they were designed more for the Mediterranean, and they did find out that whenever they took them out into the Atlantic, which of course the North Atlantic is pretty well known for being rough, the bows of the ships were susceptible to being damaged when in service in the North Atlantic, and so they were primarily kept in the Mediterranean, just because the bows of the ships just weren't designed as strong as they needed to be for that sort of intense sea state. So from here, we have the Italians who built the Vittorio Veneto class. These were started commissioning in 1940. Again, remember, Italy didn't sign that Second London Naval Conference because they were building these. 15-inch gun battleships, 9 guns in total between 3 turrets. There's some... It's referred to as both the Vittorio Veneto class and the Littorio class. For those of you that aren't aware, ship classes are generally named for the first ship of the class. But this one is named for both, and they're sort of used... Both of them are sort of used because both of the first 2 ships were laid down on the same day. Technically, the Vittorio Veneto launched first out of dry dock, but the Littorio was the one that was commissioned first. And so it's a very back and forth, which one is it? It's both. But 15-inch guns, they could do 30 knots, which did make them faster than even the Dunkirks. They weighed 44,000 tons at normal load. They built 3 of them. They had a 4th one laid down before the Italian armistice in 1943. And after that armistice is when one of these was sunk. The Vittorio Veneto, the Littorio, and the Roma, which was the 3rd ship, were all ordered to leave Italian ports and go to other colonial ports, not to be used, but just to be held. Usually, they were ordered to go to British ports, primarily in North Africa. I have hydrated. And en route, the Roma, the newest one, which was commissioned in 1942, so a year old at this point, was struck by a German flying bomb and subsequently sunk. So that was the only one of these that was sunk, and it was after the Italian surrender. The Vittorio Veneto and the Littorio both survived to the end of the war. I don't remember exactly. I believe they were given as rewards to the victorious allies. I don't recall who they went to. I don't believe they were ever used. I think they were both just scrapped at that point, which is a shame because they are very pretty and they were very capable ships. But yes, but as I mentioned before, that second Dunkirk being up-armored was because the Dunkirks were being built when the French learned about the Italian plans to build these. And so, again, at the time not having anything that would be able to compete with these, the French slightly modified the design of the Dunkirks for the Strasbourg, the second ship, to give it a little bit more armor so that it could have a slightly better chance if it ever had to come up against one of these, while the French worked on building their own larger battleships. This is another ship that I like the design of most of these ships, I will be honest. They're all very pretty. Most of them are decently capable. Most of them. These ones, unfortunately, fortunately for the Allies, unfortunately for the Italians, didn't see a whole lot of use. Hydra. But, yeah. So in response to this, of course, the French built the Richelots. They're like, well, they're building 15-inch gun ships. We're going to build 15-inch gun ships. Almost. 15 inch is technically 381 millimeters, and the French refused to do anything in weird millimeter numbers, so they built them at 380 millimeter guns. So basically 15-inch, but not technically quite. Prophecy has come true. I have been still sleepy through this whole weekend. Well, yes. Oh, Seth is... Everyone's very sleepy today. Only 1 cup of milk? Or no. 90%... Oh, he's hella vibing. But it's still a little bit EP. But yes, of course, the French found out about the Italians building the Vittorios, and they're like, hey, we need something to compete with that. Now, at the time these ships were designed and laid down, only 1 cup, we can fix it, don't worry. Barrel's pretty awake. Jiraiya's also pretty awake. All right, people are waking up. What? Necra, hello. Hold up. I got this. Maybe. I can't type. Seth beat me to it. Thank you. Well, welcome. How are you? You were playing the hot vampire game. How was it? I hope you guys had fun. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Demon Boy Ren. I'm tired and I will play just about anything. And today I'm teaching history stuff because I promised you guys that I would. But yes, welcome. We're going through the essentially we're going through the continental European naval arms race in the interwar period. Well, interwar period into sort of the war period. Hello, I didn't hear you. Sorry, but I do know. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I hope you two had fun. But yes. Where was I? Yes. So the French found out about these. And they're like, okay, well, at the time, we're just gonna up armor the second Dunkirk because we already have those sort of being built. And we're going to work on our own 15-inch gun battleship design, which they already had basic stuff out for. They already had basic like design ideas and stuff, and companies working on it. But they're like, okay, so essentially what they went with is a larger version of the Dunkirks. They like the Dunkirks worked decently well. Hi, Xian. They were like, the Dunkirks worked pretty well. They're happy with that design. They're familiar with it at that point, so you're fine, Xian. Oh, the Richelieu was the French built some very pretty ships. Once we get to the interwar period, at least. Their World War I stuff was kind of weird, and their, like, pre-dreadnoughts were horrendous. I love ships. Oh my gosh. A fellow ship enjoyer? Hell yeah. We love it. Why are you late to class? Yeah, why are you late? I did see if YouTube Studio had like glasses or something I could put on the model, but it didn't. Go grab food by hook. Oh yes, go get some good food. I appreciate the raid. Yes, so the French. I am here now. I am sat. Good boy. But yeah, so the French saw the Vittorios. They're like, hey, we need something that can actually fight that. We'll up armor the Strasbourg, but we need something that can actually go toe to toe with these, if possible. They developed these essentially larger version of the Dunkirks, armed with 15-inch guns, speeds up to 32 knots, which did make them 2 knots faster than the Littorios and over 2 knots faster than the Dunkirks themselves. But France was never the quickest when it came to battleship development or construction. And so, as you can sort of see here, the first ship was completed only days before France capitulated to Germany in 1940. And it was sat in French African ports. Again, far away from Europe, so it couldn't be used, but also it wasn't because of the complicated politics of Vichy France and Free France and Germany. It wasn't going to be used for anything. The second, the Jean Bart, was slightly completed. It was well underway. It was floating. It was moved to North Africa, where it was sort of used as a floating battery. Like for instance, in Operation Torch, the Allied naval invasion of North Africa, it It only had one of its main gun turrets, and it did get into a gunfight with the USS Massachusetts, which was, of course, a complete ship and ended up winning. And the Jean Bart wouldn't actually be properly finished until after the war. They finished the Jean Bart, and the Richelieu and the Jean Bart went until the mid to late 50s, when they were decommissioned, because at that point they were large, expensive, and battleships were pretty well past their prime. But these were developed in response to the Littorios or Vittorio Venetos. France has just historically been a little bit slow on the draw when it's come to ship development and shipbuilding, at least battleship development and battleship building. But these were pretty solid ships when they actually got finished. Then you have the German Bismarck class. Of course, the Germans at this point see, hey, those French are building 15-inch gun-armed battleships, and we're allowed to build battleships now because of the Anglo-German agreement, so we're going to go ahead and work on our own. And so they developed the Bismarck class, which you can see here. The first one also commissioned, like the French, in 1940. And I think it's actually the same as, yeah. So all three of these classes, the first ones were commissioned in 1940. These ones were built just that the Italians had more modern, better ships. These were built in response to the Italians. These were built in response to the Germans. So obviously, development was started just once they heard that the other country was working on development themselves. I don't know why I put 2 guns. Man, I was really tired when I was making this. There were 2 ships. 2 ships constructed, though they were never in commission at the same time. By the time the second one, the Tirpitz, was commissioned, the Bismarck had already been sunk, I believe. I'm not actually 100% sure on that, now that I think about it. If they were in service at the same time, it was not for long. But they were also armed, like the French and Italian ships, with 15-inch guns, 8 of them. So the same number as the French, but in the more standard layout of 4 twin turrets, 2 at the front, 2 at the back. Again, technically supposed to be treaty battleships, but the treaties were sort of... Germany never really listened to much anyways. Flag I can't show... Well, I can't. Twitch and later on YouTube would get very mad at me if I did. And I didn't want to put the current German flag because that also upsets people sometimes whenever they see something associated with this era of Germany associated with the current German flag. People get upset at that too. So I was like, I'm just going to play it safe and just... You know what country it is. It says it at the top. But the Bismarcks could do 30 knots, which made them as fast as the Italians, and only 2 knots slower than the Richelieus. Very heavily armored, although, importantly, because Germany had been out of ship development for so long, in particular battleship development, the last thing they had to go off of, like they hadn't really been designing stuff. I am standing up in my desk to stretch. Good, as you should. Like the French and the Italians, while they couldn't build ships during the treaty periods, they could at least still work on designs and figure out what worked, what didn't, conceptually. The Germans weren't allowed to build anything, so they weren't really doing that too much. Which meant that when it came time to build modern battleships, the closest thing they had was World War I era German dreadnoughts. So the armor scheme, while the armor itself was very good on the Bismarcks, the armor layout, where it was positioned, how thick it was in different areas, was a bit dated. And that is actually one of the things that did come to fruition when the Bismarck herself was sunk. Hands up, hands are up. Hi, Rose. Both of them were sunk. The Bismarck was sunk probably most famously, probably one of the most famous ship sinkings in the Second World War. Thank you for the stretch. And the hydrate. Oh my gosh. Ugh. Because the Bismarck and her escorting cruiser, the German Prinz Eugen, met the HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales, a battle cruiser and battleship respectively, at the Battle of the Denmark Strait, in which the HMS Hood was sunk quite spectacularly and tragically. But the goal there was to get the Bismarck out into the Atlantic so that it could be a surface raider against Allied convoys, which the British obviously didn't want to happen because it was a massive and very powerful ship and would wreak havoc on convoys, and it would mean that they would have to divert a lot of resources to try to just defend convoys. Which obviously they were already sending a lot of stuff, but it was mostly destroyers and cruisers. They'd have to start sending battleships, in particular modern battleships, which they didn't have a lot of. But after that, the Bismarck was slightly damaged in that battle, and so it was trying to make its way to France, where it was being shadowed by a cruiser, which again, the cruiser could outrun it, could stay out of range of the Bismarck's guns, but could keep the Bismarck in radar range so they can monitor it. And eventually it was attacked by planes from the HMS Ark Royal, an aircraft carrier, which managed to land a torpedo and jam the rudder. And as a result, the Bismarck was just stuck going in circles as various different Royal Navy ships closed in to eventually sink it. The Tirpitz, after seeing what happened to the Bismarck, the Germans were like, okay, we got the Tirpitz. We're scared of losing this one, so we don't really know what to do with it. And so what they ended up doing was they ended up parking it basically in a fjord in Norway where it could be easily defended. Heiluni. Because, of course, there's mountains on both sides. They could fill the whole area with smoke so that air raids can't really see. And it kept it out of range of the Royal Navy, or of the Royal Air Force's main bombers. Hi, Classic. Sorry for being late. Can I borrow someone's notes? I'll give you some notes after class. Don't worry. But the sheer threat of the Tirpitz being there was a major issue for the Arctic convoys, because while the Germans never really intended it to go out and raid the Arctic convoys going from the UK to the Soviet Union. What do you mean you can't show the flag? It's a flag that Twitch and YouTube don't like. They get very upset about. Yeah, it's that flag. Exactly. Exactly. But the sheer threat of it being there caused a lot of issues and a lot of havoc in the Arctic convoys going from the UK to the Soviet Union for the Lend-Lease. In one instance, I forget, it was PQ, I don't remember the number, but one of the convoys going it was reported that the Tirpitz was headed towards them, and so they scattered, and all of the convoy escorts sort of left, and it was just each convoy ship for themselves, and as a result, most of them were sunk by submarines. Importantly, the Tirpitz had never left. It was a false alarm, but just the threat of that ship being there caused a lot of problems, and so the British, particularly the Royal Air Force, spent a lot of resources trying to sink her, and eventually they did. Hi, Azura. Eventually they did. They used bombs that were developed to penetrate the extremely heavily defended submarine pens that the Germans had built, and they took those and they kept trying to drop them on the Tirpitz. It took many, many tries, but eventually they got it, and the ship was sunk there in the fjord. Thank you for the hydrate. Oh god, I forgot I didn't turn that off. Alright, that's fine. That's fine. It's fine. Let me go set my timer for 3 minutes. Alright, but so yes, the Tirpitz, it makes it accurate. I mean, I suppose you're not wrong. That's fine. Was sunk in the Norwegian fjords. The only time she ever fired her main 15-inch guns in anger was when she was taking out a Norwegian weather reporting station. She never fought any other surface ships. She just kind of was mostly sat there and then eventually was sunk by an attack. So, oh my gosh, you're late, Asien. I can't believe you. That's fine. That's okay. Yes. So those are the classes that were really involved in that sort of arms race that happened in the continental European naval powers. That being said, they still had other battleships. Most of them were World War I era battleships that they still had lying around and were kept in various stages of use. So we're still going to go over those just that you can see sort of how each country treated their stuff. So the Germans, the only battleships I should say, that they were allowed to keep after World War I was some of their pre-dreadnoughts. None of the dreadnoughts, which were at the time the modern powerful ones. The pre-dreadnoughts were very outdated. not particularly useful. And so at the time of World War II started, they actually had two still in service. They had the Schlesien and the Schleswig-Holstein. Being pre-dreadnoughts, they were older. The class, so this is the first Deutschland class, not to be confused with the Panzerschiff Deutschland class from the 1930s. But there were initially 5 of these ships, I believe. At the point that World War II started, there were only 2 left. The 2 left were both commissioned in 1908, so they were getting on pretty far in age. They were 31 years old at this point, and had been outdated pretty soon after they were made. They could only do up to 19.1 knots. They only weighed 13,000 tons, which for a battleship is slow. Yes. What's the question, Mr. Classic? Blah, blah, blah. Does this include proposed ships? It does. It includes ships that were developed and were at least laid down. It doesn't include any like ones that were just on paper. I don't believe. Well, no. Every ship in here was at least laid down. Not all of them were finished. They were at least laid down. Oh, that's the timer. Okay. I was gonna say no. Yeah, no. Like the H-44, those were purely only on paper. They never built those. Because there would be like 20 million more ships if I started including the paper stuff. Yes, so the thing with pre-dreadnoughts, part of what made them outdated is they were slower, only up to 19.1 knots. And also, they weren't as well armored as the dreadnoughts, and their guns were sort of all over the place, you know? Most dreadnoughts and subsequent battleships that you looked at had a large battery of high caliber guns as the main battery. Pre-dreadnoughts really didn't. They usually had at most 4 of their largest gun size, in this case 11-inch guns. You can see front turret there, back turret there. And then they have a large amount of secondary and tertiary guns. So a lot of 6.7-inch guns and 3.5-inch guns in this place. It's sort of just bristling with all sorts of random miscellaneous guns. Which made logistics and handling and stuff a bit more of a pain. And yeah. Both of these ships, I mean, didn't do much throughout the war. I believe it was the Schlesien. Actually, it was one of the 2. I don't remember exactly which one. Actually fired the opening shots of the war when it bombarded a Polish town during the German invasion of Poland. And then they sort of just served as gun platforms for naval support and training ships pretty much up through the end of the war, where they were both scuttled, sunk, self-inflicted. One of them was mined. I don't remember the other one. So they sunk them. I believe both of them were raised and scrapped after the war. But, I mean, they were not going to be much use to anyone, anyways, at their age with their design. But again, after World War I, that was all Germany was allowed to keep. So, then the other German ships is the Scharnhorst class. So this is a later design. Oh, and we're already back to that. Okay, I see how it is. That's fine. Back on that. All right. So this one was a bit of an interesting design. So it was commissioned the first one was commissioned in 1939, Scharnhorst. It used an improved version of the 11-inch guns found on the Deutschlands, the new Deutschlands, not the old ones, the Panzerschiffs, not the pre-dreadnoughts. Ideally, the Germans did want to put 15-inch guns on them, so 3 15-inch gun turrets with 2 guns apiece. However, they didn't want to risk angering the UK at the time. When these were being designed and then built. Keep in mind, the war didn't start until later in 39. And so they kept them with 11-inch guns, which was more or less fine with them. 32,000 tons, so it was getting up to that treaty limit, or that treaty tonnage limit, but still under it. And they could do 31 knots. So they were, I mean, they were proved to be fairly decent battleships. Not used for a whole lot, much like most of the German capital ships, mostly surface raiders against convoys. They did sink British aircraft carrier at one point that was out on anti-submarine duty. They ran into the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau with some destroyers and it got sunk. I believe it was HMS Glorious. One other thing to point out is that when the ships were designed, they had this sort of stem flat bow, which they found out didn't work very well in heavier seas like you might find in the North Atlantic. And so they replaced it with this clipper bow that you see over here on the right, to the right of my head, which fares a lot better. It's flared, it goes forward, so it helps basically in heavy seas, it pushes the water away from the ship a little bit, doesn't let it all just kind of come over the front. Helped the seafaring a decent amount. But they were decent ships. Both of them, of course, were also sunk. The Gneisenau was bombed a lot and eventually ended up in port where they were actually going to fit her with 15-inch guns, but then she kept getting bombed and they kept having to fix her, and so they just eventually sank her and used her as a breakwater. The Scharnhorst was sunk by a British battleship after it was lured out to go chase a convoy, and the British were able to intercept it and take it out. So now they're one of them throughout the war. The ads will also be starting soon. I do apologize. I'll try to not go over too much while the ads are going, just that you guys don't miss anything. So we get to the French dreadnoughts. This is again where I go. The French were not particularly quick on the uptake when it came to naval warfare. These were the first French dreadnoughts. It's better than my unit. Oh, God. But they weren't commissioned until 1913. Keep in mind, HMS Dreadnought, the first Dreadnought, came out in 1906. So while the Corvette... Oh, that's the timer. Well, while the Corvettes might have been decent battleships, they were already a bit dated at the time they came out. One big thing to look at is they still have what they call wing turrets. You can see them there. Oh, the ads are starting. Yes. I'm going to keep talking about these, it's fine. They had what were called wing turrets, which were there. Now, these turrets did give you a heavier broadside and higher gun count, but they could only fire over one side of the ship. So you're a bit limited there. You're also putting a very heavy part of the ship much closer to the edge, which doesn't help your center of gravity, makes them a little bit more unstable. Ad hell, I'll be back in 16 hours. No. This is something that by this point, most countries that had... Pretty much all the countries that were making dreadnoughts had already moved away from, as they'd found that putting all of the guns on the center line was a much more efficient and much more stable use. If I'm not home by daylight, send help. Will do, Miss Beryl. So these, at the time they were commissioned, I mean, they were still capable ships. They were still dreadnoughts. They could still go toe-to-toe with other dreadnoughts, but they were a little bit dated in their design, and they were commissioned quite late. I mean, they were commissioned only a year before World War II started, being the first dreadnoughts of a supposed major naval power. Again, France was just a little bit slow. 23,000 tons was about right for that era of ship. Maybe a little bit on the small side, but nothing horribly small. 21 knots was your standard dreadnought type ship. Speed, that was generally considered the standard in World War I. But again, 1913, they only had 12-inch guns. You're getting to a point where the ships of other nations are all using 14-inch or 13.5-inch guns, and the French are just now coming out with their first dreadnought. It's still got wing turrets. It's only got 12-inch guns. They're decent ships, but they're nothing amazing. And at the time, they are already kind of a little bit dated. Especially when you keep in mind that means that all the ships before this that the French were building were still essentially pre-dreadnoughts, which were already obsolete when they were being commissioned at that point. But yes, but in World War II, there were still two of them. They didn't do, or two in service as battleships. I believe one was in service as a barracks ship or something along those lines. But they didn't really do much, of course, with France capitulating, and then they were just kind of there. They were never really used or done for much. Thank you for the head pats. The ads are almost over. I'll wait until the ads are over before we move on to the next ship. My throat's going to be very sore by the end of this, but that's okay. All right, as we're over, welcome back. Oh, Starcatch Arrow, thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. But yes, so we progress from the Corbeils to the Britons. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's French. These were basically, the French wanted better battleships than the Corbeils, which they already knew were a little bit dated when they came out. They were still based on the hull of the Corbeils because that was essentially the limit of what French dockyards could build. They didn't really have anything that could build larger ships than that. So based on a very similar hull, but they moved those wing turrets to the center line. They upped the guns from 12-inch to 340 mil, which is around 13.4-inch guns. Again, the French didn't care about inches. They only care about millimeters and making that number nice and pretty. Speed of 20 knots. Again, 21 knots was about your standard for a dreadnought. Commissioned in 1916. Keep in mind, this is only the second class of dreadnoughts that the French commissioned. And they only started commissioning them halfway through World War I. A little bit slow on the uptake. But again, decent ships, nothing amazing, nothing terrible. By the time that you get to World War II, there are 3 of them in commission. Of those 3, 2 of them would be sunk. One would be sunk by the British at the aforementioned attack of Mirza al-Kabir. I forget, I believe that was the Provence or the Paris. I don't remember which one. I think it was the Provence. And another one would be sunk twice, as it was sunk and then raised, and then it was at Toulon when the French scuttled their fleet, and so it was sunk there again. But again, 24,000 tons, because that was really the limit of what French dockyards at the time could build. So there you have the French World War I era ships that made it to World War II. Yes, there were updates made in the interwar period, nothing super drastic, but they were improved and they were kept up to date as well as the French could. But yes, that's the extent of the French ships. And we go on to the Italians. So the Italians were a little bit ahead of the French, at least in terms of getting out dreadnoughts. 1914 is actually, I believe, the same year, or I guess 1 year after the Corbeils. But importantly, this was not the first Italian dreadnoughts. They had the Dante Alighieri, or however you pronounce it, which was the first Italian dreadnought, which was commissioned prior to this. So a little bit of the head of the French, but not by a whole lot. And so there were 2 of these ships left in World War II. Trying to think. So whenever they were initially built, they had a total of 13 12-inch guns. They had 3 triple turrets, 1 amidships, like you see up here in this picture at the top. There's a turret in the middle, and then 2 twins, which are the raised ones above the other triples down at the bottom. Speed of 21.5 knots, fairly standard dreadnought, weighing about 23,000 tons. Nothing amazing, nothing bad, just a decent standard example of a dreadnought. In the interwar period, Italy did something that a lot of people debate whether it was a good idea or not. They spent a lot of money and a lot of materials on refitting that, like on essentially completely, no, I have not done the US, on essentially rebuilding their old battleships to make them significantly more up to date and better. To the point of, like, we're talking like they're removing an entire turret, which, keep in mind, the turrets and the barbettes that they sit in are a major part of a battleship's structure. So the fact that you're removing that and replacing it with other stuff, these are major changes. Bringing it from 21.5 up to 27 knots, so a lot more contemporary, still nothing amazing, but, you know, it's still going to be slower than the actual World War II era battleships, but decent. Up to 29,000 tons as well. Hi, Wesley. But yeah, it's very controversial because for each one of these ships that the Italians did this with, for the only a little bit more money, they could have just built a new ship. They would still have the old ship in its old form, which might be a little bit dated, but it's still usable. and then they would have a new actual modern ship that's more capable of going up against other modern warships, but they didn't. They spent their money massively rehauling or refitting and rebuilding their older battleships. Both of them were survived. Both of them survived the war. One of them was sunk in the Battle of Taranto, or the attack on Taranto. I forget exactly if it's called a battle or just an attack, which was essentially the British took their carrier aircraft and launched an attack on the Italian port at Taranto. Is the stream buffering for anyone, or is it still doing okay? It's having a little bit of a stroke on my end, but I think it's all good. Now this was actually sort of a precursor, or like an example of like a lot of people like to say, and we don't know for sure how much this impacted the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but it was sort of a very similar thing. It happened in 1940, so prior to the Japanese attack. So the British taking carrier aircraft and attacking a major Italian anchorage and sinking, in this case, one of these ships and damaging other ships. British did it with one carrier and only a few planes. The Japanese, of course, would come in and do it with a lot more. But it was sort of a, I guess as far as the Japanese were concerned, like a proof of contact. What's the word? Concept, that one. But yeah, both of these ships survived. One of them was sunk, but it was then raised, but it never really did anything after that. I don't believe the Italians ever really finished properly repairing it or getting it back into service before the armistice in 1943. And the other Italian World War I era ships that were still there were the Andrea Dorias, which were very similar to the previous Conte di Cavours. It was the Andrea Doria, and I believe this was the Julio Cesare as well. So again, two ships, same gun layout as built, same gun layout after the refit. Similarly, went from 21. These ones didn't get as fast, only up to 26 knots. I believe they had a little bit more armor than their predecessors, but apart from that, they were very similar ships. 24,000 up to 29,000 tons. And both of them did survive the war. I believe one of them after the war was given to the Soviets, which is basically a death sentence because the Soviets were notorious for not maintaining ships, something that the Russians have continued to this day. Maintenance is optional. It'll just keep working, right? But yeah, so the Italians, again, spent a lot of money and a lot of resources rebuilding their old ships. A lot of people argue it would have been better. They would have been better off had they just built new ones, but they didn't, so we'll never know. Well, they did build some, but they could have built more had they not done this. Now, as you can tell by the flag, I hope, we're on to the Americans. So, in World War I, which a lot of these ships made it over to World War II as well, the US had their quote-unquote standard class. This wasn't one class, this was a lot of classes. Let me see, you had started with the Nevadas, you had the Pennsylvanias, the New Mexicos, the Tennessees, and then the Colorados. So that's, I can math. 5 classes in total that were all built with similar characteristics. Same speed, pretty much same turning circle. Again, they all do that 21 knots. Basically designed to all work as a single cohesive fleet. So nothing was a whole lot different. The biggest jump was from the 14-inch guns that all the other classes had to the 16-inch guns that the Colorados had. The top right there, you can see a Colorado. Here you actually see the USS New York, which was the last class of battleship that the US built before they adopted the full like standard class battleships. So high Sigma. The other thing with the standards that will later become pretty wide used among most battleships was the all or nothing armored scheme. Essentially, we're going to heavily armor the important places, you know, the magazines, the machinery spaces, those are going to be very, very well armored. But as a result, we're basically not going to armor everywhere else. Because if everywhere else gets damaged, there's nothing important there. That's fine. If those areas get damaged, the ship is essentially done for. Mostly 14-inch guns, but again, you had some 16-inch guns The New Yorks were the last class before the Standards, and they were still in commission in World War II, both of them, the USS New York and the USS Texas. Whenever they were built, they had what you can sort of see on the Colorado up here, is these cage masts, which were known to be a bit flimsy. In all their refits, they were upgraded to tripods. Various different, radar systems and stuff were used during the various different refits over the years. But so this is basically the World War I era backbone. This is all the ships that were at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked, all the battleships and stuff that were damaged and sunk. There were these standard class battleships. So they were older World War I designs. So the US, again, with the various different naval treaties and naval conferences that placed limits, like initially 35,000 tons, 14-inch guns. The US had, of course, like everyone else, worked on developing ships in the interwar period, just that they had an idea of what they would build. When they got time to actually build something, they started building these, the North Carolina class. Importantly, they did build them such that they could swap the 14-inch guns out with 16-inch guns at relatively late notice without too much difficulty. And so that's what they did, because while they were being designed, and I believe after construction had started on at least the North Carolina, the escalator clause was invoked as Japan and Italy had refused to sign the updated treaty, and so 16-inch guns were allowed. So they were, as a result, equipped with 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward, 1 aft. Basically what you'd see on every World War II era US battleship. They built 2 of them in total, the first one being commissioned in 1941. They did weigh that required 35,000 tons that was put in the treaty, and they could do about 27.5 knots. So nothing amazing, faster than all the World War I contemporaries, or all their World War I predecessors, but not necessarily as fast as a lot of the, the Littorios, the Bismarcks, the Richelieus could outrun them. But these did also have larger guns. And importantly to note, with the North Carolinas, they did have slightly thinner armor, because generally, when the US built battleships, they built them armored against their own caliber guns. So the North Carolinas were eventually armed with 16-inch guns, but to save weight, and because they were initially designed with 14-inch guns, the armor was designed more to work against 14-inch guns than against 16-inch guns. Luckily, they never got into any battles where that became a particular issue, but they were slightly lighter armored than they normally would have been. The follow-up class to this was the South Dakota class. Essentially, again, after the escalator clause is invoked, the US didn't really take advantage of that increased in tonnage limit, still 35,000 tons. And this essentially made up for the deficiencies in the North Carolinas. The armor was increased, so armored actually against their own 16-inch guns. They used the same 16-inch guns as the North Carolinas. They had that same speed. Importantly also to note, the South Dakotas were actually a good bit shorter than the North Carolinas. They weren't nearly as long. That's partly to make up for the weight of that armor and trying to keep within that 35,000 ton displacement. The other big thing that they include that the North Carolinas didn't is the North Carolinas didn't really have a good place for any command structure on board. By that I mean, or to be used as a flagship. So generally when a ship is used as a flagship, of course the admiral is on it, and the admiral has his own group of people that come with him, advisors and stuff like that. And the North Carolina didn't really have the facilities to properly be a flagship, so the South Dakotas were built with that involved, as well as increasing the armor, but slightly shortening the ship just to make up. And you can sort of tell if we go back and forth, South Dakota's got a little bit more room at the back, but it's got less room in front of the forward gun, and it does have a slightly shorter superstructure than the North Carolina does. That's a longer superstructure. You've got more space up there in front of the main turret, or in front of the forward turrets, but a little bit less space behind the back. But overall, the South Dakotas were a little bit more compact than their predecessors, but better armored and better for use as a flagship. This was then followed up by the Iowa class. This was essentially an attempt to make a battleship that could keep up with cruisers and stuff. Because in World War II, we progressed from your standard battleships and battle cruisers to what was called a fast battleship. The Dunkirks, the Richelieus, the Littorios, the Bismarcks, the Scharnhorsts, the South Dakotas, the North Carolinas, the Iowas, they were all considered fast battleships. So still qualify as battleships. They still have the armor, the guns, but they're faster. Which is why you sort of see the use of battle cruisers stop. Because it's like, okay, well now, if we want to build a battle cruiser, it's just going to be a fast battleship that just doesn't have the armor anymore. But also if we can just build a battleship that'll have all that stuff, but also the armor, why would we not do that? See, this is why you see battleship or battle cruisers die out in the interwar period and in World War II. But the Iowas were very long, 880 feet, which is around 270 meters, significantly longer than North Carolinas or the South Dakotas. They did have an improved version of the 16-inch guns that you found on the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas. So longer range, better penetration, just better versions of the guns. And they could do 32 knots. But importantly, the armor layout wasn't really any different than the South Dakotas. As one person put it, the Iowas were essentially, you gained roughly 10,000 tons going from 35,000 to 48, purely just to get an extra 5 knots of speed from the 27.5 knots the Sodaks could do to the 32 knots the Iowas. That was really purely done by the length. And at one point after the war, the USS New Jersey, while on speed trials, was clocked at over 35 knots. So they could do that. Again, speed trials are also done in the best possible situations, lightest load on the ship, clear weather. But 32 knots was their general given top speed. These ships would be the longest serving ships, or the last serving battleships. The last one was fully decommissioned in the 1990s. From the end of World War II to the 1990s, they were brought in and out of commission, or brought in and out of mothballs, various different times, various different wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Operation Desert Storm involved use of the Iowas, but that was kind of the last one. It was, battleships hadn't really been a major thing since World War II, so them being still in service at that point was purely just for the guns and the shore bombardment, and to be scary, more or less. Yes, last battleships built for the US. However, there was one other class that was planned and was initially, I believe, actually laid down. That was the Montana class. So this used the same guns as the Iowas, but they added a 4th turret. So 2 turrets in the front, 2 turrets in the back for 12 16-inch guns in total. The ship would have been significantly longer than even the Iowas. It was also the first US battleship that was designed to be wider than the Panama Canal, meaning that if it wanted to go from the east side of the US to the west, or vice versa, it would have to go all the way down around the southern point of South America. Only a speed of 28 knots put the tonnage up to 63,000 tons. They sort of just got to the point, because these were laid down relatively late in the war, and they were looking at their needs, and really the main use of battleships at that point were either shore bombardment, which even the World War I era battleships could do, or carrier escorts. But of course, if your carrier escort is slower than the aircraft carrier, it's not a very good escort. Your aircraft carriers could normally do 30 plus knots, which meant that these were too slow to really serve as escort carriers, or as carrier escorts. And yeah, they had a lot of big guns, but it was mainly for shore bombardment, and they just weren't really needed. They had plenty of other ships that could do the same thing. And of course, being battleships, massively expensive. So despite being laid down, they were canceled just because the US Navy looked at them and were like, we have no real use for these. So we're gonna not pursue this because it didn't make sense, which is fair. Nerd. Well, yes, that's me. Correct. So then that covers the US ships. Now we're on to British development. So the British had, of course, their World War I era ships that were still in service, starting with the Revenge class. Had 8 15-inch guns. The British 15-inch gun in World War I was probably one of, if not the best battleship caliber gun used in the war, and it's generally agreed upon to be a very, very good gun. Commissioned starting in 1916. Keep in mind, the British had a lot of other dreadnoughts. They'd been building dreadnoughts since 1906, but because of the various interwar treaties and budget cuts, they had scrapped the vast majority of those. So this is just what was left. These ones were, it's not like the French or Italians where that's what they had built in the first place and they just still had it. The British had a lot of other stuff. They just didn't need it or couldn't keep it. So they scrapped it. And that's why these are 1916, still in service in World War II. Standard 21 knots. Of the 5 ships, one of them was sunk very early on in the war. This reminds me of a scenario I read about in mangas. What can I do for you to change that F into an A+? That's crazy. That's wild. They were updated in the interwar period, with better fire control and stuff, but not massively refitted. They were, compared to the other World War I era battleships that the UK had, the Revenges weren't quite as good or as robust. And so, while they were still solid ships, they were a little bit dated by the time you get to World War II. Primarily used for convoy escorts, occasionally used for shore bombardment, stuff like that. The other ships that you had were the Queen Elizabeths, which, importantly, these were actually commissioned before the Revenges. These were a slight departure in that they could do 23 knots as opposed to the regular 21. Basically, the British just wanted to have a class of battleship that was faster so that they could, if they needed to go more toe-to-toe with like a battle cruiser or be able to more dictate their range of an engagement against German ships, they wanted a class of battleship that could do that. But after this one, they were kind of like, well, we don't really need that, so that's why they went back to the 21 knots on the Revenges. But the same 15-inch guns as the Revenges had. Another 5 ships were made, 23 knots instead of 21. Again, only one of them was sunk. It was actually sunk in the Mediterranean. It was the HMS Barham. I believe it was sunk by Italian frogmen, if I'm remembering correctly. In one of the ports. I don't remember exactly which one, but they served pretty well throughout both world wars. But after the war, were all scrapped because after World War II, were all scrapped because they just didn't have a use for them. Despite HMS Warspite being one of the most popular British battleships of all time. A lot of people wanted to keep her around as a museum. The British just didn't have the money for it, and so they scrapped her. And then, everyone's favorite part, the British still actually had battle cruisers. They were the only country that did. They were World War I era. The pride of the entire British fleet, they're like, hey, this is our bestest, biggest ship that we absolutely love. This is our pride and joy. Was a battle cruiser. Again, battle cruisers could work when used properly. They just weren't usually used properly. Because as the war as time progressed, World War I especially getting into World War II, it just became a case of, okay, where does this really fit? The world of fast battleships and all that, and aircraft. And the answer is they really just didn't. So you have the HMS Hood, which weirdly was an Admiral class battle cruiser. One of the few instances with capital ships or ships in general where you'll see that the name of the lead class or the lead ship of the class is not the name of the class. It's an Admiralty class. It's HMS Hood, commissioned in 1920. So after World War II, it was designed using a lot of the stuff that the British had learned during the war, in particular at the Battle of Jutland, where their battle cruisers did notoriously not particularly great. Had 8 15-inch guns, the same gun layouts as the Revenge and the Queen Elizabeth classes. And it weighed 46,000 tons. It's It made it the largest warship in the interwar period and the largest warship up until the Japanese built the Yamato, which we will talk about later. It do 32 knots. It did come in as a result of adding more armor to make it. It was a battle cruiser, but it was almost kind of the first example of a fast battleship. It wasn't quite armored as well as a battleship was, but it was more armored than British battle cruisers tended to be because of what they learned during the First World War. As a result, that meant that the ship did sit much lower in the water than it was initially intended, which meant that that quarterdeck in the back had a freeboard of only about 9 feet, which when you're in like the Atlantic or traveling around the world is not very much. It tended to be underwater a lot of the time. And as a result, there was sort of a running joke that the HMS Hood was the biggest submarine in the Royal Navy. I mean, she was perfectly seaworthy and didn't have any issues. It was just that area was very low and would get very wet. She would be sunk by the German Bismarck in that Battle of the Denmark Strait that we did talk about a little bit earlier. It was a very lucky shot from the Bismarck. The problem that the Hood had was, of course, being a battleship or a battle cruiser going up against a battleship. And while the British had plans to massively modernize the Hood, they just hadn't had the time to do so yet. It was scheduled for, I believe, later in that year or in 1941. But they sent the Hood out with the HMS Prince of Wales. And because it was an older ship, it had more outdated armor scheme. While it was mid-turn to get all of its... Because initially when the battle started, the Bismarck was showing its side to the Hood, which was streaming straight at it. As the Hood turned to get its rear guns firing as well, the Bismarck got a lucky hit, went straight into a magazine, blew up, and of the 1,300 plus people on the ship, only 3 people survived. It is a major tragedy, but that is also one of the things is that, again, being the pride of the Royal Navy, the Bismarck sinking it basically meant that the British were going to do everything they possibly could to sink the Bismarck, and they were successful in doing so. They were able to sink it before it could get back to France for repairs after that battle. The other ships that they had were the Renown class, which I'm going to move myself over a little bit. That you can see, there's a picture of one of them there. That is post. The Renowns initially had a superstructure more similar to what you see on the Hood. But they were refitted, or one of them was refitted. The Renown was refitted in the interwar period to have the more updated, what the British generally gave their ships. You can see it on the Queen Elizabeth as well. This is a World War I era. This is post refit. They changed the layout of the superstructure. These were, I believe, called the Queen Anne's Castle, is what this was like jokingly referred to as. I could be wrong. But so the Renowns did get that. The Hood was again scheduled to, but just sunk before it could happen. Of those two, one of them was sunk by aircraft while in service in the Pacific. The other one was mainly used as convoy escorts and stuff like that, so didn't see a whole lot of major surface action. But they were still in service, and as you can sort of predict, the battle cruisers in the world of fast battleships just didn't. Battle cruisers in the world of fast battleships and aircraft didn't hold up very well. So then you have the Nelson class. This class was built at sort of an interesting time period. When the Washington Naval Treaty was signed in 1922, the US had the Colorados either built or in construction with 16-inch guns. The Japanese had the Nagato class built or in construction with 16-inch guns. The British didn't have any battleships with 16-inch guns. And of course, being at the time one of, if not the major naval power in the world, they were like, hey, we should get a ship with 16-inch guns. And so there was a portion written in where the British were allowed to build 2 16-inch gun-armed battleships that did have to fit within the treaty limits outside of that, so that maximum of 35,000 tons. And they were allowed to build those during that like sort of 10-year building holiday, while other people weren't allowed to build stuff. So they built these. They got their 16-inch guns. They were a little bit weird in that having that all-gun forward arrangement, especially considering that that third gun was lower than the one in front of it, which meant it couldn't shoot straight forward. This was done as a weight saving measure because, of course, underneath here is where you're going to have all your magazines, which are an area that you want heavily armored. If you have 2 guns up here and then 1 back here, that means that heavily armored area is going to be a lot larger, which is going to take a lot more armor and a lot more weight. Well, if you're trying to cut down on weight to fit within that 35,000 ton limit, you don't want that. Let me get that timer going. All right. So yeah, so that's why these were built with all those guns forward, was to minimize the area that had to be armored to save weight, to help it fit within that 35,000 tons. They could also do the same 23 knots as the Queen Elizabeths, which were faster than most of their contemporaries at the time. They did have some interesting gimmicks. I know their structures were built a little bit lighter than the British would have liked normally. And so they could potentially sometimes get a little bit damaged or a little bit warped or something in heavy seas, because again, they were trying to save weight. I know at some points they had issues with the rollers on the turrets because stuff here would flex and then it wouldn't align properly, and that could cause issues, I believe at least. And the kind of unfortunate thing for them is that the British 16-inch gun was good, but honestly, it almost would have been better, at least in my opinion, if they just stuck with the 15-inch guns. It would have been easier on logistics, and the 15-inch gun that they had was still really good. Thank you for the hydrate dry. And the stretch. Oh god. Oy. The other thing that they had was because of this rear turret's proximity to the bridge, which was right here on the superstructure, if it was facing over the side of the ship and raised, they couldn't fire the guns basically, because it would basically mess up a bunch of stuff on the bridge, which is not what you want. So that rear turret was kind of limited in where it could actually fire. It couldn't aim too far back or raise too high if it was, or else it risked damaging the superstructure of the ship. But again, it's sort of like a half modern. There's a game that has warships like this, right? Yes, World of Warships. Yep, I've played that quite a bit. But yeah, so it's kind of a weird ship. Had some issues, but it's like a mixture of, it's sort of like the bridging point between World War I era design and World War II era design, sort of like a weird midpoint. It did what it needed to do. It gave the Royal Navy 16-inch gun battleships at a time where they didn't have any. And it did serve throughout the end of the war. Both of them served throughout the end of the war. There were 2 of them. I don't know why I didn't put that over there. But they both survived. They were scrapped soon after the war, just because, again, they had those other mentioned issues. And again, at that point, battleships were pretty much on the way out, if not out. Then, the British built the King George V class. This was the first class of battleship that they built after the lifting of the building holiday imposed by the naval treaties. Oh, that's the timer done. So it was built around that 35,000 tons. I can't fucking type apparently because I missed a 0 in there. I'm going to do that. Good. So they did come in once they were actually built at 36,000, but again with the escalator clause that was fine at that point in time. They were armed with 14-inch guns in 2 quadruple turrets, 1 forward, 1 back, and then a twin turret above that. Those turrets did give the British issues initially. But they did get it sorted out. They were the only country other than the French that put quad turrets on a battleship, and it was only on this class. Pretty standard speed of battleships at the time, 28 knots. Of the 5 ships built, 1 of them was sunk, also in the Pacific with the HMS Repulse, that battlecruiser mentioned earlier, by a Japanese aircraft. The other ones all served throughout the end of the war and would end up being scrapped. They did want to put larger guns on them, but they did run into some issues. By the time it would take them to build the guns and the turrets for the larger guns, it would massively delay the construction of the battleships. And also just the redesigning the ships to work with the larger caliber guns would also massively delay the construction of the battleships. And they're like, 14 inches fine. We'll just keep going and we'll get these things out. And then we'll build some better battleships while we've got these to sort of hold it for the time being. What was that other battleship? Well, it was planned to be the Lion class that you can see here. Planned, never built. They were laid down. I believe the first two were laid down in 1941, getting to various stages of construction before they were finally officially canceled. The primary issue that they had was, at the time, the British had other building priorities. They needed a lot of escorts. The battle in the Atlantic against the German U-boats was not going particularly well. They needed destroyers and corvettes more than they needed battleships. And, as mentioned before, they had issues getting those 16-inch guns and turrets built. They had other priorities, and it was just taking them a long time to get that stuff built. They didn't want to reuse the 16-inch guns of the Nelsons because those had their own issues. This was a new design that was supposed to be much better. By the time the ships were finally canceled, they'd only built 4 guns and no turrets. It looks so flat. It was a little bit flat. The British battleships tended to be a little bit flat. I quite like their designs. I think like the KGVs were very pretty looking ships. It took me they are an acquired taste, I'll say that. The Nelsons are just ugly. KGVs look good. These I think look decent. But they're supposed to have 9 16-inch guns, speed of 30 knots, 40,000 tons. A hull shape generally based on the same hull as the King George V class. Britain, exactly, yes. 11 cups of milk, that's not too bad. That's not too bad. 43% EP, also not too bad. Thank you for the lurk, Draco. But yeah, these were planned to be built, never actually finished. Good night, Draco. The fact that something like that doesn't sink is so incomprehensible to my non-boat knowing brain. I mean, both of these pictures are only showing above the waterline. Obviously, there would be a lot of shit below this as well. That might be part of what's causing the confusion. If we go back to see, oh, that's a waterline. I don't know. I know I have some in here that show the below waterline portion. Yeah, it's just a diagram. This just shows what you would have seen when it was in the water. There's a lot of hull below this. I mean, you got the rudder and the propellers back here and all that. That's why like what you see here is more or less the same as what you see there. But yeah, never built, just took too long. Didn't have the spread thin. They needed other things more than they needed battleships. KGVs were doing all right. And then after this, though, they did actually build a battleship, which was the HMS Vanguard. It was commissioned in 1946. It was generally based on the hull of a Lion class battleship, which again, they had started construction of. The problem is that as they learned various things through the war, they kept stopping and redesigning and then continuing and then stopping and redesigning and continuing. So the ship wasn't actually completed commissioned until 1946, after the war was over. To get around the issue of not being able to build the 16-inch guns and turrets in a timely manner, they had various different 15-inch guns and 15-inch gun turrets left over from battle cruisers that in the interwar period had been rebuilt into aircraft carriers to help meet the treaty limits, because they couldn't use them as battle cruisers, but they could keep them as aircraft carriers. So they removed the guns and the turrets, and they still had them lying around, so they used them on the HMS Vanguard. So they were actually older guns and older turrets, but again, those 15-inch British guns were very potent. They were very good, so that wasn't a problem. And they modified the turrets that they could perform a little bit better than the actual initially would have in World War I. But because it got stuck in that sort of development hell, it wasn't finished till after the war. It is the only British battleship. As you can see with the Lions, they had what was called a transom stern, which is that flat portion there at the back. You see other battleships didn't have that. They were all curved. So it's the battle cruisers. The Lions were supposed to be the first one with that, because that, I don't know hydrodynamics, apparently helped the ship go faster. Gave it like an extra third of a knot, which is, I mean, not horrible if it's just designing the end of the stern of a ship like that. So this is the only British battleship that was ever built with that. The Lions were supposed to, and since this was based on a Lion hull, it still had it. But yeah, could do 30 knots. And it was the last battleship ever built and commissioned in the world. It stayed in service through the 50s. I believe it was decommissioned around 1960, making it the last British battleship. I believe the last battleship outside of the US that was ever in service as well. Obviously never really fought because it wasn't commissioned until after the war, and it wasn't really involved in any major wars after that. It might have been. There might have been a couple, like might have been involved in the Korean War, maybe. I don't know for certain, but regardless, last British battleship. I think it's a very good looking ship. I know some people are hit or miss on it, but I quite like it. So then, what the hell were the Japanese doing? You might be asking, which is a good and very valid question to ask. So, the Japanese have, or had, different philosophies sometimes than the Western portions. But at the same time, they also didn't. For instance, the Japanese sort of went into the same line of thinking that the Italians did of, well, we're not going to build new ships. We're just going to rebuild essentially the ones that we already have to sort of get around, it's like, oh, well, they can't get mad at us for building new ships because we didn't. But also we've basically got new ships because we've completely rebuilt our old ones. So the first ones that they did that with, or the oldest ones that they had for that at the time, were the Congo class, which were, I will point out, initially built as battle cruisers. That's what you see up here in the top right. World War I, 1913, battle cruisers armed with 8 14-inch guns, not particularly heavily armored, but relatively fast at the time, 27.5 knots. Built 4 of them. In the interwar period, they were massively rebuilt. Tonnage went from 27,000 up to 32,000. Speed went up to 30.5 knots. Same 14-inch guns, maybe slightly updated turrets. I'm not actually sure if they got that or not. But same, still 8 14-inch guns. Of course, you can tell they went with the standard Japanese pagoda-style mast, which a lot of people love. I don't. That's a personal issue. And off topic. The important thing to note is, while they may have increased the armor a little bit during the rebuild, it wasn't by a massive amount. And after the rebuild, the Japanese did consider them battleships. We already know what happens when you take a battle cruiser up against an actual battleship. We saw what happened there with the Hood. We saw what happened there at the Battle of Jutland in World War I. The Japanese were like, no, that can't be us. These are battleships now. And they proceeded to use them as such, with predictable results of all 4 being sunk. Now, not all of them were sunk by battleships. I believe torpedoes were involved in some, or aircraft were involved in some. But I know at least one of them, I believe the Kirishima, was absolutely walloped by the USS Washington, which was a North Carolina class battleship, because it was still essentially a battle cruiser that the Japanese just like pretending was not. But they were decent ships. They did what the Japanese needed them to do until they sunk, but none of them survived the war. And that was what it was. The second class that we've got is the Fuso class. 2 ships, again, 14-inch guns, but this time they had 12 across 6 twin turrets. Again, went through a massive rebuilding in the interwar period. Not as extensive as the Congos. They didn't go in and like, I think they might have still gone in and changed the engines around a little bit. But the guns and stuff stayed relatively the same. You can see the old World War I era Fuso there at the bottom, commissioned in 1915, and what it looked like more in the late 30s to 40s in the top right. Again, went with that pagoda-style mast. That rebuild did increase them from 29,000 to 34,000 tons. Could do 24.5 knots. Now, part of that is done also in part because they weren't as heavily armored as their counterparts. Being World War I era ships, speed didn't really increase under the rebuild despite the extra weight, just because they did get more powerful engines, but they didn't actually make them faster. They just sort of kept it at the same place despite the extra weight, which is, I mean, not bad. But being dated and, while decently armed, not as armored as some of their contemporaries in World War I were, they were also both sunk in World War II. The Fuso, I believe it was the Fuso, or was it the Yamashiro? Regardless, was actually involved in the last ever instance of a Crossing of the enemy's T. For those of you that don't know what that means, for decades and potentially much longer than that in naval warfare, the ideal position was crossing your enemy's T. Essentially, you had the side of your ship pointing at them, high tiny, and they had the front of their ship pointing at you, making a T. This was ideal because it meant that you could fire all of your broadside at them, but they could only fire back with whatever guns they had on the front of their ship. So this was really the ideal situation to be in. And during the Battle of Surigao Strait, while the US was invading the Philippines in World War II, or re-invading the Philippines, I'm going to so much like, well, yes. I don't look. There will be a quiz after it. There won't. But they were going through the Surigao Strait, which, unfortunately for them, they had been spotted prior to that, and there was a large number of U.S. World War I era standard battleships, again, of various different assorted classes, but all fairly similar in terms of speed and like steering capability, that knew they were coming. So they just sort of lined up across the channel, or across the strait, and then as the Fuso or Yamashiro, whichever one it was, I don't remember, one of them had been sunk prior to that by torpedoes, like during that same trip, and then the other one encountered, I believe it was 6 American battleships all crossing their T, and they were pretty quickly reduced to a wreck as well. So they were okay battleships, nothing amazing, nothing horrible. They did the job. Well, they did maybe the job, but it did exist. Then this one's where they get a little bit weird. The Issei class battleships, very similar to the Fusos, but the Japanese were looking at it and realized, hey, the Fusos have some limitations, like the placement of their midships turrets leaves a lot to be desired as far as like actual firing angles for them and various other things. So the Isseis were essentially an improvement on the Fusos. Again, 2 ships commissioned in 1915. Same guns, same general gun layout of 12 guns in 6 twin turrets. But initially 31,000 tons when commissioned, as opposed to the 29,000 of the Fusos. Slightly better armor, but similar, well, and a little bit slower, 23 knots. After the rebuild, they went up to 25 knots and 42,000 tons. So theoretically made a lot more capable. One thing that the Isseis did have that was interesting, though, was that later in the war, the Japanese, of course, having lost a lot of their aircraft carriers, were in need of more aircraft carrier and capable ships. And so what they did is they took the Isseis, the Issei and the Hyuga, I believe it is pronounced. Probably not, but you know. They removed the rear 2 turrets and they replaced it with a flight deck, as you can see here, so that they could serve as essentially hybrid battleship aircraft carriers. After that, the Japanese had other issues with building planes and in particular securing pilots, so they never really had a massive air wing on them. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be massive air wing in the first place, but they never got anywhere close to what they were supposed to be equipped with. And both of them also ended up sunk as well. So yeah, weird little hybrid carriers. The Japanese needed more aircraft carrying capable ships, so they adapted it, but they were never really given much of an air wing, so it didn't really end up doing anything, and they got sunk anyway. So next up, you have the Nagatos. So this is the ships that the Japanese were building in the Washington Naval Treaty, or had built, or had just built 2 of, that had 16-inch guns. The Americans had the Colorados with 16-inch guns, and that's why the British wanted the Nelsons with their 16-inch guns, just that they could sort of compete and stay on parity. Commissioned first one in 1920, 8 16-inch guns, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. 32,000 tons as built at 26 knots. During their rebuild in the interwar period, they were increased to 39,000 tons at 25 knots, so they did get a little bit slower. But they were the second most powerful battleships in the Japanese Navy. Despite that they didn't see as much use as the Congos in particular were used a lot by the Japanese in World War II. Until, of course, they were all sunk. The Nagatos were used, but not as extensively, despite being the second most powerful ships that they had. But also, interesting, only one of them was sunk in the war. The other one survived. And the one that was sunk wasn't even sunk by an enemy. It was just in port, or I say in port, it was in anchorage in Japan, and it just blew up. The magazine just exploded and the ship sunk. No one's really sure why. Some people think it could have been sabotage, could have been an issue with some of the ammunition or some of the gunpowder, or just a mistake that someone made. But regardless, the ship got sunk in port without anyone else doing anything to it. And the other one made it to the end of the war. So I guess they were the most successful Japanese battleships in World War II because one of them made it. And that's the criteria that we're going with for them because it's the only one that did. It's the only Japanese battleship that survived the war. The Mutsu is the one that blew up, the Nagato's sister ship. The Nagato herself lived and was used for some other stuff that we will see later on, later in the war. And of course, the last ships, some of the most famous ones out there, is the Japanese Yamato class. Largest battleships ever made. They displaced around 70,000 tons at normal load. Full load was significantly heavier than that. They made 2 of them. They were planning to make more than that, but of course the Japanese during World War II, we know, had issues with getting enough resources to build more ships because they didn't have a massive amount of resources in the home islands, and trying to get stuff through there became increasingly difficult as the US Navy's presence in the Pacific increased and theirs dwindled. But they were equipped with 9 18.1-inch guns, and it could do about 27 knots. Their armor was the thickest armor, I believe, ever fitted to a battleship, and they sort of used that to make up for the questionable quality. There's something called heat treating that happens on armor that can essentially, despite not making the armor thicker, can increase its durability, how well it can take hits, and things like that. Well, the Americans had a lot of heat-treated armor. They could use it over like pretty much the entire ship. A lot of the European countries used it mostly on like the main armor sections of the ship, and they would use slightly lesser quality armor in the other areas. The Japanese armor quality was sort of all over the place. But it was very thick, which helped make up for it. It's also why the ship weighed 70,000 tons. Both of them, the Yamato and the Musashi, were sunk by aircraft, which really kind of goes to show you why World War II was sort of the last hurrah of the battleship, as it were, because these were essentially the 2 largest and technically, number-wise looking at it, most powerful battleships ever made, and they were both sunk by aircraft from aircraft carriers. Because there's not much you can do when the enemy is attacking you from further away than you can even see, let alone shoot. Well, actually, some of these ships could shoot farther than they could see, but, you know. So both of them did not survive the war. And yeah, that's really all there. I mean, there's probably more you could go on and say about those, but massive ships never really did a whole lot. They just kind of sailed around. They used a lot of fuel when they did, which was not great for the Japanese either. And yeah, and then both ended up getting taken out by aircraft, unfortunately. So this is the fun part. Where are they now? Where are all of these massive, powerful ships now? Right? Good question. Glad you asked. A lot of them got sunk. I mean, most of the German and Japanese battleships got sunk. Actually, I think all of the German battleships were sunk. All of the Japanese battleships except one were sunk. The Italians only really lost one. The British lost a couple. The French lost most of theirs, although most of them were self-inflicted. The Americans only really lost the Americans only lost battleships at Pearl Harbor, and of those, only two of them, one of which wasn't even in use as a battleship anymore, stayed permanently lost, and that is the one that they actually lost that was still in service as a battleship was the USS Arizona, which you can see the wreckage of down here in the bottom left. You have the British HMS Royal Oak, which was the Revenge class battleship that got sunk. As we'll be starting soon, I apologize. Down here in the bottom right, and the wreck of the German Bismarck up there in the top right. Pretty obvious how this happened. A lot of them sunk by aircraft. A lot of them also just sunk by other random miscellaneous things, torpedoes. Not a lot of them were sunk by surface fire from other battleships. The Scharnhorst was, that's the main one I can think of. The Kirishima on the Japanese side was, and probably a few other, but the majority of them were sunk by either torpedoes or aircraft. A lot of them would be scrapped. Ones that did survive the war, if they weren't American, they would be scrapped, essentially. And even if they were American, it's a good, some of those got scrapped as well. Basically, it's post-war. Again, World War II was ridiculously expensive for everyone involved. Once again, sort of at the end, the only country that was maybe in an okay financial position was the US. Europe was a mess. Japan was a mess. So, not that they had anything anyways, but they couldn't really... Well, A, they didn't really need them because the war was over. And this one was a lot more definitive than the end of World War I. Battleships were very expensive, so pretty much immediately after the war, most of them mothballed their fleets, which means that they're still in commission. They can still be reactivated, but they're not in active use. They have skeleton crews just to maintain the ships, basically, and that's it. And at this point, again, it was pretty much clear that aircraft carriers were the way of the future. Planes could take out a battleship way further away than battleships could do anything about. So there wasn't really a massive point in keeping the battleships around. Now that the ads have started, so that I don't do anything important, we're going to go back a little bit. There's the weird stepchild that I mentioned in here. So one of the Yamato-class battleships was being rebuilt. Remember that sneeze? Ow. Was actually rebuilt as an aircraft carrier, the Shinano, which I believe there's only 2 or 3 pictures that ever existed of it. Largest aircraft carrier in the world at the time. Still, I believe it was about 70 to 80,000 tons. While it was mostly finished, but there were still parts of it that were under construction, and it was sailing off the coast of Japan to a different area to pick up its air wings, which again, being late in the war, were going to be small and depleted, not really where the Japanese wanted them, but it was what they had. And it was torpedoed and sunk by the USS Archerfish, which was contested. The captain claimed he'd sunk an aircraft carrier, or a major aircraft carrier, and all the higher-ups in the US were like, no, we don't have any records of that one, because there weren't any records of it. And they didn't find out about it until after the war, when they were like, oh, okay, shoot, you did actually sink that. Good job. So yes, I don't have any pictures of that one on here, but that did exist. There was a Yamato that was converted into an aircraft carrier and was sunk before it could ever do anything. This time by a submarine and not by aircraft, which is, I guess, different than the rest of its sisters, but still sort of goes to show that battleships, while they used to be the top dog, were not so much the top dog anymore. There was a lot of stuff developing that could sink them, with them not being able to do a whole lot about it. Granted, it wasn't helped that because the ship was still under construction, there were still civilians on board building and fixing stuff. And because the captain in charge was like, hey, I've got this massive, powerful ship, it can take a torpedo hit or 2 and keep going. And so they didn't slow down, which, if you've got a big hole in the side of your ship and you continue at high speeds, it's just going to damage your ship more, force more water in, break more bulkheads, damage more stuff. And so he didn't realize until too late how bad the damage actually was. And at that point, they couldn't close some of the watertight doors and stuff because, again, the ship was still being built. And so that's why that one went down as relatively easily as it did. Not that it would have been a massive help to the Japanese had they actually finished it and gotten air wings on it, because, again, they didn't have trained pilots or a massive amount of planes. And it was kind of a weird carrier design anyways, because it was very much meant to be a battleship that they sort of last minute kind of swapped into a carrier. But we'll go back now, since people will be back from the ends now. But yeah, so post-war, like French and English in particular, the Germans, of course, all their stuff was sunk. The Italians, most of their stuff was given away, and the stuff that they did have was generally scrapped pretty quick after, because it's also, you know, you sell the ship for scrapping, you get some money out of it, and you can reuse the resources somewhere else. So, okay, we need money. We don't need all these ships. We're going to go ahead and start getting rid of them. Obviously, they got rid of like the World War I era stuff first, and then later on they would get rid of the World War II era stuff. Testing. This is another thing that was used for. Of course, in World War II, they discovered, you know, the US discovered the atomic bomb. They were like, hey, what happens if we try to use this in a naval war? What happens? How does it work? So they did Operation Crossroads, which was a series of atomic bomb tests at the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. The overall goal is just to see what happens if, you know, if we do like an underwater nuclear bomb. So if we made like a nuclear mine, what happens if we drop one, like if it's, you know, an air explosion, what does that do to the ships? And of course, being after the war, they had a lot of ships that they no longer really needed. And also ships that they won. For instance, the Japanese Nagato, their only surviving battleship, was given to the US and was used here. The USS Arkansas, which you can see down here in the bottom left, was the oldest World War I era battleship that the US had kept in service as a battleship during the war. It was used as well. And I mean, you know, they were just used for testing. You can sort of see in the picture, there's the Nagato with that massive plume coming from one of the tests. I don't remember exactly which one that one is. And this one's actually the most interesting, I guess, most harrowing one maybe to me. So if you look, so this is the USS Arkansas. That vertical line there is the Arkansas standing on end. This was during the underwater test. The Arkansas was relatively close to it. So the force pushed the ship on its end. I believe it was, I don't remember if it was the front or the back, but on one of those as it flipped over. Just from the force of the explosion and the pressure wave, which is insane to me, because I mean, this is still, you know, a mid 20 to upper 20,000 ton warship. It's not small, and it did that. Eventually they figured out that nuclear weapons weren't super effective in naval warfare. They weren't horrible, but they were nothing particularly special, and so they didn't really pursue that. I mean, obviously naval warfare, nuclear weapons still existed, like missiles. They even made some nuclear shells for the Iowa class at some point. But it was never really used, luckily. I mean, nuclear weapons haven't really been used, but it was never really pushed very far. And the other potential use case for them was as museum ships. These ones are only in the US. I apologize if you live anywhere else in the world. The only, again, after the war, like, a lot of countries were strapped for cash, and maintaining battleships as museums is ridiculously expensive. And so the US was kind of the only country that had the money to do so. Some of them were actually reactivated at various points. For instance, as I said previously, the Iowas, like the USS New Jersey you see down here at the bottom, were actually reactivated several times for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Operation Desert Storm in the 90s. And so they were used. Only the Iowas, the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas were not. And not all of them were kept, of course, with the exception of the USS Texas, which you see up here in the top right, which at this point in time is the only remaining dreadnought battleship in the world. That's the only World War I era battleship that the US kept, the only World War I era battleship that was kept point blank anywhere. You have something like the USS Alabama, which was a South Dakota class. There are 2 South Dakotas, that and the Massachusetts, that are still available as museum ships. And then you have the USS North Carolina of the North Carolina class that was kept as a museum ship in North Carolina. Then you have all 4 Iowas, the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Wisconsin, and the Massachusetts, are all still available as museum ships, sort of scattered around the coast. Not Massachusetts, sorry, Missouri is based in Hawaii. I think the Iowa's in Los Angeles. The New Jersey is in New Jersey, and the Wisconsin is in Virginia. So that's really the options for what to do with them after. If they weren't sunk, they were pretty much all scrapped. Two that I know of, possibly more, but two that I know of. Actually, no, there was more. I know the USS Nevada was used for the testing, and there were probably a couple others that were used for that. The ones that survived that weren't horribly irradiated were sick. Have you ever gone to visit any of the ships that I docked? Yes, no, I have. I mean, that's what they're there for. I went and visited the USS Texas when I was. It's been years, but I've actually visited both of these two, the Alabama and the Texas, when I was a kid. I want to go back and visit them at some point. The Texas actually just got out of a dry dock phase. She was in pretty rough shape, so they pulled her into a dry dock, got her fixed up. They're still working on her, but I believe she's supposed to be open to the public again next year. Actually drove past the Alabama when I was moving from Texas to Florida. I got some pictures of it from a distance. Didn't have time to stop. I've never visited in Iowa. I want to go visit one at some point, but they're all kind of far away, so just haven't had time. But that would be nice to do at some point. But yes, I have visited them. If you like naval history, or you just like ships, or you want to learn stuff, highly recommend. They're all, at least all the ones that I've heard of and all the ones I've seen, are great. So getting to the end, what lessons did they learn? Well, battleships, great for shore bombardment, fantastic for that. Of course, you've got massive guns shooting very explosive projectiles at stationary targets on the shore, which are a lot easier to hit than other ships, so that's great. They're still scary. Like, if you roll up in another ship and you see a battleship on the other side, you're kind of scared. And they're fantastic at fighting other surface ships, because that's kind of what they're designed to do. The downsides that they found out, though, especially in World War II, planes could beat a battleship. Planes are a lot cheaper. Battleships are very expensive. They're very costly to make. They're very costly to maintain. They take a long time and a lot of resources to make. Whereas planes are relatively cheap, and a few planes can take out a battleship if done properly, or if they get lucky. So the battleships were sort of like, I mean, it's like, yeah, they're still cool and all, but we'd rather just have planes and aircraft carriers at this point, because it'll be much more effective. And that's still more or less what's happened today, of course, with missiles and stuff, missile development and all that. At this point, it's all gotten a little bit more convoluted, but aircraft carriers are still generally considered the more powerful of the surface ships in any modern navy. And that all started pretty much in World War II, when, again, the two most powerful battleships in the world got sunk by planes, as well as a lot of other ones. Sort of a carrier versus battleship. Planes are a lot cheaper than a ship. They can massively outrange a ship's guns. The ship can have AA guns, but that's really kind of it. And in World War II, those were questionable in their effectiveness. The battleships, yeah, guns are cool. And they're great when they're not fighting something with planes, but if they're fighting something with planes is probably going to win. And that's really sort of the crux of it. That's why World War II is generally seen as the last hurrah of the battleship, the end of their dominance. They were the mainstay in many navies for a good while, but just not much you can do about that when you're a massive ship. And so as a result of this, most battleships were quickly phased out of service. Again, the USS, not the USS, the HMS Vanguard was decommissioned was taken out of service in 1960. The French Richelieus were in the mid to late 50s. The only ships that ever were activated in service after that were the Iowas. Hello, Vampire. Another demon. Let's go. Let's go. I hope you're having a good day. But yeah, so just the Iowas after that. Battleships were essentially done. No one's built any since the HMS Vanguard. Thank you for the follow. And no one will. Every once in a while, you'll see people talking about, oh, but what if we reactivated the battleships? Not going to happen. At this point, they are 80 years old. Older than that, even. And with how current missiles and everything shape up, armor doesn't really do anything. Love the suit. Thank you. Armor is not particularly effective against missiles. It's also why modern warships don't really have armor. And again, the battleships can't really do a whole lot against planes, especially modern planes. I mean, you can give them, you can slap some missiles on them, but those guns take up a lot of space, so you're limited in what you can do. They're nowhere near as efficient as modern warships. So not going to be reactivated. You might see the occasional article or something about it. It's not happening. But there we go. That was 53 slides of miscellaneous information. It was a long night last night, but we got there. History stream. Yes, we did it. We successfully done a history stream. Only 2 months late. But we got there. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, maybe, perhaps. If you didn't, that's okay too. I love my history. History is great. But yes, that was good. I hope that you all had fun. Now I got to figure out. And if any of you ever have any questions or anything, always feel free to email me. I can yap about this stuff entirely too long. Especially in horror games when you saw what happened in town. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I'm not a big horror game person, but I can definitely see it. Great, thank you. No way. But let me gonna yeet it over to there. That thing is still broken. I'll fix it someday. Maybe. But thank you all very, very much for being here. I do greatly appreciate all of you. You're all wonderful. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something. And yeah, I think from there, kind of streams you do. I will usually play games. I'll play just about anything. Normally like strategy or like racing stuff, but I'll play anything whenever I get dragged into. This one was a first time I've done one of these. Maybe I'll do more at some point in the future. We'll see. But yes, I need to rest my voice as my throat is quite sore. I don't normally talk this much for this long. So we're going to write out. It's been a pleasure to meet you as well. We're going to go say hi to Shion, who's streaming. He hasn't streamed in a minute, but he is streaming today, doing some Fields of Mystery, which is always nice and cozy. So we're going to go say hi to him. And then I'm going to go drink some water and take a shower. Hi, Rye. But yes, go say hi and then do what you got to do. Eat, sleep, drink, take care of yourselves. I appreciate you all immensely. And I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye.